JIT and optimizations, right? So it's important to keep in mind that the JIT is being implemented in different ways by different browsers. Basic concept remains the same. Okay. Okay. So there is this profiler, as we said, that this is something which has been introduced recently. Okay. Like this is the component which has this the JS engine brought in. Okay. So it checks that how many times a code is run. Basically, it checks the redundant pieces of code. Okay, what happens after that? It primarily runs through. It primarily runs everything, every part of the code through the interpreter. Okay. So now what happens? There are two things that happen. One, it encounters a warm piece of code. So if a piece of code has run for a particular piece of time, for continuously it is running for a particular piece of time, it is called warm piece of code. What happens to a warm piece of code? The warm piece of code is then compiled, and that piece of code is sent to the base compiler. You know, the compiler was bifurcated into two parts: baseline compiler and optimizing compiler. It is sent to the baseline compiler. Okay. What happens then? So each and every line of that warm piece of code is stuffed. It's stuffed and is indexed corresponding to the numbers, that is the line numbers and the variable types with which the code is hit. Okay. For example, sum of that array was hit with what integer type of values, for example. So it is being stuffed with integer type of values and the line number of that particular code. Okay. Now, why is it done so? If the profiler sees that the same piece of code is being run again and again with the same variable, it will bring that optimized piece of code which it has already stored, right, and replace the redundant piece of code. Understand? That's what I said. It replaces the unoptimized bytecode with the optimized machine code. Correct? So it replaces that with the redundant piece of code. Okay. Now there is something called a hot piece of code. For example, warm is, say, suppose a particular piece of code has run for example 10 times. The hot piece of code will be if it has run for 1,000 times. Correct? So that hot piece of code is then sent to the optimizing compiler, right? Now optimizing compiler is a concept in itself. Let's see what's an optimizing compiler. Okay, we'll understand the concept. What's a warm piece of code and what's a hot piece of code, right? So suppose we have got this particular function which is some array, and we have got the some calculating logic here. So suppose if I comment this debugger, so if I run this, we can see that it gives us the sum as 21, correct? So if I switch on the debugger and if I give this as a breakpoint and then I try to run it, so you can see that this particular line gets executed 6 times, right? So this is a repeated function or repeated functionality, right, which is getting executed 6 times. So this is a warm piece of code, right, because it is being repeated n number of times and it is doing the same damn thing, right? Now suppose that this array is of length 1000, right? So if it is of length 1000, you can understand that this particular piece of code will become warm, right? Because it will go on again and again and again doing the same functionality for 1000 times. Here is where the interpreter the profiler senses that this particular piece of code is getting warm and hot, and it delegates it to the compiler. So that's the concept of a warm and hot part of the code. Right. So as we said that JavaScript is a dynamically typed language. So in this example we saw earlier also, right, where we were adding the numbers. Now in a object which is an array here, because everything in JavaScript is an object. So the array here contains numbers, right? But it can also contain a string, correct? So for this particular piece of code, to know what kind of data is coming in is impossible, right? So adding all the numbers of the array is a different task, and then concatenating two strings is a different task, right? So if I do something like this, it will go on for 6 times, and then it will give me something like this, right? This is 21 Abhishek. So uh, for JavaScript, it is absolutely okay to have an array with different data types, and that basically increases the operational overhead for JavaScript.